Hi, I'm Jeremy Ruston, and today I'd like to welcome Saq Imtiaz, who's come to talk about some of his recent developments with TiddlyWiki. Hi, Saq, how are you doing?
Hi, Jeremy. I'm doing quite okay. How about yourself?
Great, yeah. Well, Saq and I actually go back a long way because we connected through Una Mesa, the non-profit foundation that looked after TiddlyWiki Classic back in 2006, 7, something like that, I think so.
Yeah.
And I know that you've got that there's a history to your relationship with TiddlyWiki, which is roughly that a relationship of love that became one of work, that then became one of taking for granted, and then now you're perhaps in a new phase of that relationship. Would you like to talk us through the flows there?
Yeah. So I started off fiddling with TiddlyWiki because I've been working a lot with education and wanting to leverage software and realizing that things weren't customizable enough or the licensing fees were too high. But I couldn't get anyone to listen to me. So it was a bit of, well, let's see if I can actually create something usable and have something to show people. And I stumbled upon TiddlyWiki, and it was attractive because for someone that had no programming background, it seemed like, okay, this might actually be something I can wrap my head around. So I came into it basically being able to copy and paste a bit of HTML and tweak them a bit. And through a lot of help through the Google groups and reading up basic JavaScript skills, that kind of progressed to doing a lot of work supported by Una Mesa, using TiddlyWiki in educational context. We had instructor notebooks that synced with student notebooks that people had at home. We used it a bit in distance learning. But the more I fiddled with it for work, the less I used it myself. It's hard to explain why, but it was just always the case of it always felt unfinished and therefore not something I could actually use for work because there were, bits that weren't working yet because I was tweaking with them, this, that, and everything. Work took a slightly different direction some years ago now, at which point my relationship with TiddlyWiki is basically that I stopped using it. And I came back to it late 2017 for a personal project, which is when I started working with TiddlyWiki 5. And, I spent a few weeks putting things together to work the way I wanted to, which went surprisingly easy because TiddlyWiki 5 kind of just did everything I wanted out of the box. And from then until maybe a month ago, I haven't fiddled with it, but I actually use it on a daily basis. So basically, it went from working with it all the time, but never personally using it, to not actually working with it, but using it all the time.
One of the things that characterizes those mods that you made, I guess, on your first pickup of TiddlyWiki 5 in 2017 was that you weren't afraid to modify the core JavaScript modules where you needed to. So I guess you were at the right kind of point where you were not afraid to navigate your way through to the 6 lines of code that needed some minor tweak. And I guess that, yeah, interesting how you were able to do that, I think partly because of your experience with TiddlyWiki Classic, even though TiddlyWiki Classic's internals are completely different. But is that fair?
I think it definitely helped. The TiddlyWiki Classic experience did help, so the approach to plugins and everything is just drastically different.
Yeah.
In TiddlyWiki Classic, you want to do anything that the core doesn't do, you go ahead and write some JavaScript. In TiddlyWiki 5, 99.9% of what you want to do can be done with widgets that already exist. And you automatically pick up this idea that if you want to create something new that isn't supported, you should create a widget that is, again, reusable and not just something one-off, which I think is wonderful. So actually, I managed to do everything I wanted to on my first pass through with TiddlyWiki 5, which was having 2 stories up and running without writing any JavaScript. And in the end, it was like that 1% of sprinkling on top to get some keyboard handling in, which is not something that we're currently very good at in TiddlyWiki. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that, for me, who started off as a non-developer, and now, while I still don't work as a developer, I would consider myself at least competent as a developer. TiddlyWiki Classic was actually my manual for learning how to code. I learned how to code by reading the TiddlyWiki Classic code from beginning to end. And I think there were points in TiddlyWiki Classic days where, after yourself and maybe a couple of others, I probably knew that code better than anyone, not because of competence, but just because I'd spent that time going through it all. which also means that your coding style comes very naturally to me. So
Yes.
that helps as well. It makes it easier to follow those logical leaps as to where the
Yes.
code's going to go and how it's going to get structured.
Yes, indeed. Well, great. Well, let's, and in fact, back in, I think, 2018, you virtually attended the TiddlyWiki meetup in Paris, and I think showed us an earlier version of the dual story stuff, which went down really well with people. So, do you want to talk us through what you've got here?
Okay, so what I have here today, let's see, let's make sure you can see my screen. Can
Yeah,
you?
I
Okay.
think.
Okay, so what I'm going to show today is kind of my note-taking workflow, which is a little bit atypical. I don't think it's how most people use TiddlyWiki for note-taking. I think especially currently, the focus is heavily on a very metadata-heavy, interconnected notes, that kind of thing, and discovering where the connections are. Whereas what I found is, from my experience with taking notes with TiddlyWiki and a lot of other applications over the days, is that I will at some point find the process very cumbersome of actually getting data in there and stop using them. And what's worked really well for me over the years is just text files that I can use the command line and grep through and edit in the text editor. And whenever I use a tool and it starts to feel cumbersome and I'm in a hurry, I'll go back to the command line and just use a text editor. So what I ended up doing was implementing something which is a way to get all my text files into TiddlyWiki, be able to quickly find the file I want and to edit it. And at the same time, they still live as text files on the hard drive. So I have the best of both worlds. I can add metadata on to these text files. I can add tags, fields, whatever I want to, so I can have a richer relationship between them, which I can explore when I have the time. But at the same time, that data does not go into the text files themselves. They still live on my hard drive as just text files, so my original workflow still works. So what you see here is a modal window that I brought up. I put this in a modal because it makes it easy to bring it up at a keystroke. I use Alt-L to bring this up. And what I can, so basically, this works well if you know your own data. I know my file names because they're text files, which means that they always have a sensible prefix. Something about TiddlyWiki is probably going to start off with the word TiddlyWiki or TW, otherwise it's difficult to find your text file. So here we have all the content from tiddlywiki.com that I've pulled in as an example. So let's say I want to look up how to customize Tiddler file names, since that's something we're kind of talking about right now. So what I do is I just start typing in, and the results start to get filtered. There's two things to note here. One is that up here, you have an autocomplete happening. Based on the text that I typed in, it tries to guess what tiddler I want. And this is starting with a prefix match. So it's looking for those words at the beginning of a title. And it prioritizes them according to my sort field. So I have title ascending right now. If it was modified, the result would be different. And down here, you just have the results of a regular search with the auto-completed title highlighted. So that's not exactly the one I wanted. So I could keep typing until I get customizing tiddler file naming. Or after I just type that much, I can just hit the down key arrow, which will bring me to customize TiddlyWiki, hit down key 2 more times, and I'm in the tiddler I want, customizing tiddler file naming. I hit tab and I can start typing, and those edits are automatically being saved. So that is sort of the basic workflow. So I find it really quick to be able to bring up this modal, find any tiddler I want to either refer to some information or add in some quick notes. The other thing that you can do is customizing tiddler file naming, new pre-release. Let's say I want to write down some new information for the new pre-release. There's no tiddler. I can hit enter and it creates that tiddler. And again, I can just start adding whatever information I wanted to. New core patch needed, for example, because I do run a core patch. So again, a very convenient workflow. So everything here is keyboard driven. Even while I'm in this text field down here, I can hit Alt J and K to kind of navigate between these tiddlers. I can hit Alt L to get back to my search field. So it works really well for me. I'm not really sure that this would be something other people would find useful, but there might be ideas in here that are useful. And I think it's a very good showcase of how versatile TiddlyWiki is and just how much you can do with it. I really do think of it more as a toolkit for building applications rather than an application that's, already expressing all of its features out of the box.
Little thing at the bottom there, so you got some arrows hiding something.
Yeah, so if you click down here, that brings up a tagging interface. And the tag kind of operates on the same idea of autocomplete as the search field up there. It's again more useful if you know your tag names, but it also means that I don't have to fiddle with the tag drop down, which
Sure.
hasn't been the most user friendly for keyboard use, but I know we have updates coming there as well that should make that a bit easier. What else? The modal is resizable, so I can resize this if I need to. And we have some options down here. So by default, we don't include system and shadow tiddlers because it's just not a use case for me. I do have that toggle there because once in a while I have like broken the edit template and needed another way to edit it really quickly, and then it turns out to be handy. You can also open this in a new window, which I'll come to in a second. It also has a horizontal layout. Sometimes that's useful when you kind of want to be able to see more search results at a glance. But most of the time, it's the vertical layout that I end up using. And yeah, you can resize the size of the search results as well to only show as many as you need to. Again, not something that's used often, but it was easy enough to do, so why not? In addition to that, let's see, I did make some notes as to things that I wanted to show you guys. I'm going to take a quick look at that. Okay, so I can show you a different example that's kind of maybe a little bit more typical. So I can hit Alt-Q to reset my my search results. So let's say I want to look up information on saving a TiddlyWiki, right? So, okay, saving. So we have some results come up. I'm going to make this list a bit longer. Okay, so I can basically just go through that now and quickly see whatever results it is that I am interested in. Also note that you can preview things as well instead of necessarily having to see it in edit mode. And when you're previewing things, you can again hit Alt J and K to move through them quickly, so things don't have to be in edit mode. So sometimes I also use this as a search feature. I bring up my modal, find the tiddler I want to, and then I can just hit Alt O, and that will open it in the story. So saving with Tiddly Fox just opened in the story behind us right here. I can also open in the second story since I have a two-story layout going, so that's useful as well. You can also delete tiddlers from here, which can also be handy, though rarely used. So I feel like that gives you a bit of an idea how I use this.
Yes.
The other thing that I want to point out that's a big part of my workflow is that I don't always have TiddlyWiki open full screen or even in a window, but I do want to be able to have access to my notes. So what I'll often do is I'll pop this open in a new window. And at that point, what I will do usually is I'll just dock this on a side. And then I can be working on anything else that I want to, but I have access to all of my notes on the side, which I find extremely convenient. And that has actually made it even more user-friendly than my command line options previously. So that's pretty handy as well. You could open the same interface in a tiddler as well, and that's how I originally started off. But now I actually find that the least convenient, just because the modal in the new window just fit my workflow a lot better.
Just checking. You, in order to get that functionality of syncing all these notes files, and I appreciate these aren't your notes files, but
Yeah.
the notes are syncing to a folder. So you're running under Node.js. And is that so normally do you run the Node.js server on the same machine that you edit, or do you leave the Node.js server running somewhere and edit from your phone and so on?
So basically, it's running in a way that it's exposed to the home network, so I can basically use it from anywhere on the home network. And I haven't really had issues with synchronization clashes or anything like that.
Do you run it forever or something to keep it running, or do you just literally have a command window that you SSH into to restart it?
Well, I have it set as a startup script, so it just starts whenever the machine starts, and I have a home machine that's basically eternally running, so it's always available. The only use case that doesn't solve is being on the road, but thankfully I have a good workflow using Android apps, working with it as text files. So I would like to eventually get to the point where I have a better way to utilize the same kind of an interface with TiddlyWiki on the phone. But again, inertia has been a part of it because my current bits and pieces of my workflow fit together so well and work so well that there isn't much incentive to spend the time doing that.
And and just to be clear, that on your phone you have access to that folder full of text files, but not to the surrounding TiddlyWiki bits.
Yes, exactly.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So in terms of, I'm gonna not really go into too many technical details here, but I want to mention a couple of quick things that I think will be interesting. So, right now, especially if I X that out, and we don't have any search entry. This is something like 9,000 tiddlers in here. So it's actually impressive that you're able to get that kind of a performance where there isn't really a lag when you do a search. So to get this to work, I had to cheat and basically use inspiration from Jeremy's DynaView plugin, which lets you open up basically a bunch of tiddlers, but only the ones in view are actually being rendered. And this is doing the same thing, but inside a scrollable.
Yeah.
So basically, it's the length of the scrollable times 3. That's what's being rendered, and everything else is hidden, and it isn't rendered until you scroll or search. So that's how we're kind of working around that. Other improvements.
Oh, we just lost.
Changing.
We just lost audio for a second from you, but I could still see you moving the modal around.
Okay, so. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so I was just saying, so the resizing here is still CSS based, so sometimes it will respond a bit to the content changing, which is not ideal, but I will eventually improve that as well. And I'm also in the process of rewriting it just because I understand the core code a lot better. And also, when I first wrote this, there wasn't really keyboard shortcut support in the core, and there is now, which I can leverage.
No, that looks great. It reminds me a lot of I think it was Quicksilver on the Mac that then Apple copied a bit with Spotlight Search. Yeah,
and there's another app on the Mac called Notational Velocity, which is actually the one that directly inspired this, because that is something that fits my workflow perfectly. That is how I use text files, and it was just enabling that same workflow instead of replacing it. But the problem I had there was that I use a Windows machine and a Linux machine and an OS X machine. So I really needed something that is cross-platform, which Notational Velocity isn't. And then the added bonus here, honestly, has been that while most of the time I'm in a rush and I quickly just want to be able to find whatever information I need or throw in some quick notes, there are times when I want to explore information more in depth, and then being able to link and tag and everything is extremely useful. Other than that, what you're seeing here is basically this app that I call Notation inside of my usual TiddlyWiki layout, which is 2 windows, which you guys should all be familiar with by now. You see the basis of a task management app up here that is just really raw right now, so I'm not really going to show that off.
Do you want to just very briefly explain what's different working with 2-story rivers than the standard layout?
Well, the main difference is just this. As you can see, if I close that, all the tiddlers in second story, you have, one column of content over here, and you have a sidebar on the right, which most of the time works terrifically, but sometimes you want to be able to compare information. So, for example, saving with TiddlyFox on Android and saving with TiddlyFox normally. If I want to see those side by side to see what the differences are, being able to pop that over into a second column is extremely useful. Sometimes also I might want to be editing here while looking at some other information on the other side. And I will even use a second column sometimes as a to-do list because I will have tiddlers that I need to look at. I'll just pop them into the second story, and I could even close that second story for now, knowing that those tiddlers are there, and then open it once in a while to bring over another one to work on. When I first implemented this, I thought that it was going to be something that I used all the time. I have to admit it isn't. It is not something, I won't always have both columns open. Sometimes there's just no need for it and it's just extra clutter. But in those situations, when you do need to be able to refer to things side by side, is extremely useful to have. That's why the way I implemented this is that when you hide that second column, you should not even realize that you're not working on a standard TiddlyWiki. It's supposed to be unobtrusive. It's just supposed to disappear and not really affect anything else. And that's what it does, except for this button, which allows you to then bring up the second column. So that was sort of the idea. And this was also a reaction to basically moving to screens with a higher resolution.
Yeah,
because you have all that screen real estate, and then becomes a question of, well, how do I use it well? And OSs still aren't that great at tiling browser windows side by side. So when you know that the different windows or columns you want are within TiddlyWiki, then being able to do it within TiddlyWiki is better than having to use different browser windows.
Yeah, no, indeed. No, it's really nice. It's something that one of many things that had been envisaged in the very early days of TiddlyWiki 5, but somehow never got done until you came along. So great. I noticed you got slightly different tag widgets there. That well, not widgets.
Oh, right. So this again. So basically, because of my current relationship to TiddlyWiki, which is very like productivity focused, where I now have a background as a developer. I have a background as a UX designer, but I try not to wear those hats with TiddlyWiki because then comes the endless loop of being a perfectionist and wanting to create something perfect. So part of the reason I've been slow to share things with the community is because this isn't really organized development. It's a case of this thing is bothering me and I have 10 minutes right now, so let's improve it, which means that things are a bit haphazard. So this is like a half-baked improvement. So what I do with tagging is just that you can basically click here. It brings up the tagging interface. You add your tags, and you can just save them. In an ideal world, this tick mark to save should be inside that box. But like I said, that was enough to kind of get the job done, and then I haven't kind of finished it. Just because to me, if you've noticed with my interface for adding notes, it's usually through here. I rarely will add tags here because I'm just dropping data in really quickly. You can give default tags to everything that you add through this interface when you create new tiddlers, and I give it a tag of inbox. And then later I might go through my inbox and quickly want to add tags and not really edit the tiddler, and then being able to do that from view mode is just really useful.
Yeah, no, it's really great. Very neat. And I think you haven't shown us the buttons that for moving tiddlers between the columns.
All right, so those are over here. I call it divert because diverting a river is how I look at it. So you can click that to just move things between rivers. You also have the sidebar open, which is a lot more useful because it gives you an overview over what is in what column, and you can drag and drop things over there as well, which is pretty handy. So I went from never actually using the open sidebar to having it be a main part of my workflow now, which has been pretty nice. The only thing here that I don't like currently is if I have a tiddler open in both stories and I drag and drop it within a story, it will close it in the other one as well, because it doesn't really realize where you're dragging from. Something I'll look into later, but it's not really a deal breaker. So that's I think that's pretty much sort of like what we have here that's different from a standard TiddlyWiki. I do have a in progress attempt at a task management app. But it's just really raw right now, but it will just kind of show me up here sort of like the things that immediately need my attention so that I don't forget.
And using the new data arithmetic date comparison filters for that? Or?
No, again, this was implemented before that came into the core. So basically between December 2017 until a month ago, I didn't update anything. So I've been sort of catching up and improving things. And there's been a lot of things that have been helpful. The keyboard shortcuts, the then else syntax and filters, for example, that's been really handy. Some of the comparison filters. So I would put it this way: if I had made a wish list of what I wanted in TiddlyWiki in 2017 and come back now, I think 90% of it is there, which for me I was very happy about. It sort of felt like, okay, I sort of missed out by not opening those tickets back then, requesting features, but they got done anyway, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, and it's an inexorable process. Our development. It's not the fastest thing, but we do keep going. To pick up on one of the things you mentioned, is the filters, the then else new filter operators, which make it far more natural to express complex logic. And today on the groups, well, in fact, recently on the groups, there's been lots of discussion about static rendering. And I think we were discussing the I can't remember what it's called now, TiddlyWiki links variable that is a templated string for rendering links. And that made me feel very nostalgic because, of course, that was the best way to do that in 2013. Whereas now we do all those kinds of text transformations with filters, and they're efficient and flexible. So yeah, I think that's the big the big kind of, as the filter language has got more powerful, the realization that more and more of TiddlyWiki can be delegated to filters and therefore be accessible to user change and hacking and so on.
Yeah, I mean, filters and also action widgets, those two things together are extremely powerful.
Oh, but the horrors of action widgets is one of the things that keeps me awake at night. That I'm sure you'll be aware that if you're not careful with action widgets, they can be very counterintuitive, because you've got a string of action widgets, we'll parse them and render them right at the beginning, and then we'll step through executing them, which means that the values of attributes of those action widgets are frozen at the time that the parsing happens at the top. And so the classic one is if you refer to a variable, if an action widget modifies a tiddler, you can't pick it up in the immediately succeeding action. And it's a really fundamental and kind of vexing challenge, because mostly TiddlyWiki is quite a fun expression of how you can do complex interactions entirely declaratively. The way that our drop downs and everything work is quite nice. It's entirely declarative at the wiki text layer. But then when we clash into action widgets, it's really you really see how what we've got is nothing like the old school procedural linear execution model. And I really wonder. Well, for what it's worth, I believe that we need to parse each statement, parse each action widget just before we execute it.
Yeah, and the thing is, I've never actually run into that problem. I can see how it would arise, but off the top of my head, I feel like I vaguely remember seeing some code and invoke action that did do something like that. Am I misremembering?
The code that does try to do that.
Yeah, it does try to refresh, as in reread itself, as in reparse everything. Or am I misremembering?
No,
I feel like that's something I saw.
It's that we'd need to at the moment, no, we parse the entire action string and then step through executing it. So we'd have to have I mean, it's entirely doable, but we'd have to parse to the end of the first action string, execute that, then pick up the parsing again. And it's just not structured for that to be how it naturally works. But even then, it'll still be a bit of a kludge. So that's one of the kind of the areas where I really don't have a good picture of what even a good solution would look like.
I do have some thoughts on that, but I don't want this to turn into a very technical discussion either. So maybe we can save that for another time.
Yes, no, you're right. We should.
So did you maybe have any more questions that aren't clear about sort of my setup here, or anything that you think people might wonder about, or do you feel like we covered most things?
People will want to see some of the details that we are eliding over here, how that resizer thing works and so on. So,
right.
But I think, yes, that'll be some interesting follow-ups on the groups once we get this.
Yeah, like the resizer widget is something I'd like to be able to make reusable and post for other people to use. It's just one of those things that will be a little bit tricky for people to actually invoke correctly.
The techniques, I mean, the way that you made the modal resizable,
right? Okay.
Advantages, those kinds of techniques, and to say the divider. DynaView is kind of interesting because most people probably didn't. It's not obvious what the benefit of it is, and so again, it's a technique that it would be interesting to be discussing on the group, I guess.
Yep. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I mean, eventually, when I'm done with this rewrite, I will post this for people to be able to play with. Like I said, even if it's not immediately useful for anyone else's use case, I think it might still be interesting in terms of techniques and inspiring other ideas.
I mean, by the sound of it, with the yeah, I mean, you've got an alternate implementation to some of the things in the recent keyboard shortcuts changes. So I guess it's whether and how you publish it might be around whether we don't want to inadvertently circulate another a different way of doing the same thing.
Yeah, and the other thing I'm waiting for is that we do have improvements coming in with some keyboard support for search lists and things like that, hopefully. And I'd like to wait until that's been published so that I can adapt to using the same thing. Again, so that we don't have two solutions out there for the same problem.
Excellent. Well, I'm not sure what our time is, but I think that seems like a good point to draw to a close. So, Saq, let me say thank you very much for sharing what you've done and being such a busy participant on the group as well, discussing all of these things.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And many, many thanks.